Sometimes you read a writer or it just stops you cold.
When I look back on my childhood and I think of every adult authority figure that had some kind of ward or charge over me, parents, teachers, coaches, scoutmasters, whatever. I look back and I think of them as flight attendants and children as passengers. So on this plane, they are responsible for us. They bring us food, blankets, earbuds for the movie. There is this implicit suggestion because they are taking care of you and keeping you safe, they also know how to fly the plane. No, they don't. Every adult who has ever said, you'll understand someday when you have kids of your own or you're too young, there's this suggestion that at some point you're going to get the VIP key card and the monogram bathrobe and you're an adult and you'll have it all figured out. The reason for that long lead in is because nothing terrifies me like talking about themes in fiction when people say, so what do you write about? I don't do themes because I think I can't fly this plane. What do I know? What can I possibly tell you? You have profoundly informed opinions, deeply held convictions that you act on. And yet they inform your work and they're clearly there, but they don't eclipse it. So that's what I want to get into. You seem to lead with ideology, if that's too strong of a word, but without letting it trample the actual craft of storytelling. Am I making any sense at all? And am I even close to accurate?
There's a couple of pieces I would pull out of that. One, I was walking in the dog park about 5 years ago. I had a friend of mine. She'd read Zazen. She'd read some of my other work. She was walking past and she stopped and she was with another friend. And she said, "This is Vanessa. She's a philosopher." And, and that was literally her take. And I went back with that. I thought, that's kind of true in terms of my interaction with writing. What I mean by that is not like I'm somebody who should be listened to in that way, but I'm in somebody who's stuck in that process of trying to figure something out. And I have a very sort of Socratic nature. And so dialogue flows from that. I have never in my life sat down and said, I'm going to write a book about class or I'm going to write a book about this. Those things, and what I came to understand, which I have said, is apparently I write about the American project and whether or not it works. Those are things that I saw as my work began to emerge, that they came again and again and again. I don't know who this should be attributed to. There's the sort of old chestnut that, you write about what you know. And then there was a version of that. And it was, no, you don't write about what you write about what you don't know about what you know. And I think that's really true for me. So it's like I do end up in worlds of ideology or philosophy that I know really well, but the space as a writer that I'm interested in is where none of it lines up, where people aren't able to be reduced. I try to move up to the places in characters or in thinking where they're at the highest degree of danger in some sense of having their beliefs be scuttled completely or just going in circles around the place that can't be resolved, ambivalences and things like that. And so what that means is that a lot of my writing initially comes out because I almost always start by free writing dialogue. I'm just looking for like one line that captures my imagination. And then in dialogue, there's always a response to that line. So if the first one is a statement, then there's a response to that statement. And I'm free writing, and then I'm going to catch something that's like one or two lines. And then I go, oh, that points to something interesting. Who are these people? As I free write forward, I start to see them. So I think because it comes from that a lot of times, it's natural that where I tend to gravitate is the place of confusion, of moral confusion. And so my characters tend to have those kinds of things, but I don't hold them to ethical tests in any way. And they come up with very, very different responses, but it's very much to their world. So I think the last part I'd put into this picture about that is I miss the incredible sorting that happens with everything. Like I miss people that I didn't know what they believed, right? I meet someone in a certain setting, in a certain place, in this moment in time, I could tell you almost every belief they have down the line. There's something wrong with that. Like there's something deeply wrong with that. I miss people who are openly in conflict with each other in very clear ways. You know, not necessarily tortured by that, but like literally, like things that don't match or different opinions, things that don't slot, you know. And I don't even mean just politics. I mean, in a lot of ways, you know, the way capitalism has affected us is, you know, we've sort of niche market. We've started to treat ourselves like the perfect niche market, right? You know, I'm curating, you're selling, I'm curating, my vote is my brand or my statement is my brand or what, you know, all of these kinds of ways that we build that into our system. We're functioning like the algorithms at this point. We're functioning like, you know, an optimizing system. And so I really am drawn to people and to characters who surprise me, who don't do the things that I think that they would do. Personally, I am a very civic person. I do live out to the best of my ability many of my beliefs, but I'm also a person at odds because there are elements of me that some would describe as conservative. There are a lot of elements of me someone would describe as progressive. I have certainly been called a liberal, you know, at different times in the most unflattering term, you know, and it's like that. The difference between a civic person is like, as a civic person, I have all sorts of fiery beliefs about things. As a novelist, I just constantly see the humanity over and over and over. And so that leads you into offering an unpunished future and compassion for characters that violate the new norms of every time that, you know what I mean? Like, and I've come in with this book, I've had people who've sort of said, well, don't you think this character is predatory, or don't you think this character should be put on trial for this? And it's like, do they get punished enough? I've had a couple of people say that, and it's just, it's baffling.
Okay, so how do you start? And you answered that very clearly. You start with a character, and the character starts with a voice. You free write dialogue. Can you talk a little bit more about that, or is it just sort of a trance state that you're summoning things and you really can't articulate?
Well, I think so much of my writing emerges from questions for me, but I often don't know what the question is until I trip over it. And so when I'm free writing dialogue, I'm generally starting with questions. In Zazen, it started that way. The very first question, it was like I was two lines in, and just out of the blue, nameless characters said, "Can you sit still on fire?" And the response was that no, you'd have to move, it's biological. It was from that interaction that I began to move through what then actually still appears in the first chapter, I think, of the book. So questions are a big part of the process as I start it. It's like in music or anything else, you have to kind of get to that half mindless state a little
Hmm.
bit to where you're just babbling. But I'm looking for something provocative, you know, something that has a response for me, where it sort of calls the secondary voice to sort of come forward and push. And it's the push back I'm looking for to start to play into.
So it's not a question that you're trying to answer, but it's a question that you're putting into the mouth of a yet to be fully formed person. You're putting it in their mouth and then seeing the kind of argument that someone brings to that question, another voice. Am I getting that right?
My experience of it is very instinctual, fast free writing. It's not as clear as that.
Okay.
I think really sonically, and I think in rhythms a lot. You know, my sentence rhythms, as I choose to use them, are very conscious. But when they begin and I'm starting to find rhythms, I'm looking at something a little bit faster and like, I'm going to write voice first. I mean, I don't always start with dialogue on everything, but I am going to write voice first. I think one of the questions in this novel that didn't make it in the final, but was part of the beginning of it was, don't you wish you were born before the world was falling apart? And that was part of a conversation. But there were other parts of that conversation that did make it in. And then one of the big key questions that had been put in there never made it in because the entire character structure started to inhabit that question. Yeah, this book was a little different in that way.
Nathan is asking, so when you get your unique, compelling idea from free writing dialogue, can you talk about how you build, structure the rest of the story in your process?
So fundamentally, the first thing is to wherever there's energy, you go there, right? If something comes out of a character's mouth that could get them canceled, go there. If something comes out of a character's mouth that's a very tender part of your own personal experience that like you don't really want to go into, go there. So a lot of it is looking for that kind of that first train to hitch. It's very, very hard to tell in the beginning. Right now, I have 3 or 4 stories that I'm like maybe first paragraph of that I'm trying to find the what it is that I'm interested in. But Zazen started as a short story, and this book was supposed to be shorter than it was. So I don't know what ends up happening because the characters really do drive it. And like I have to go through an experience of going forward before I understand what it's about. So I have this experience, and I think it's probably pretty common to anybody, any of you who've been writing for a while, that I'll be writing about something. I'll go, I think I know what this is about. And then all of a sudden a line will come out about something that is much deeper and more intense, maybe more painful or more frightening. And then I'll go, oh, I had no idea I was writing about that. And I could be 150, 200 pages in. And then I'll look back and I'll realize all the breadcrumbs were there the whole time. It's not just the characters who have an unconscious or a subconscious that's acting on their conscious personality. It's us, right? And so a lot of times I feel like the part of me that's writing as I'm going is not a conscious part of me. Although I don't come out as the prophet and spew all the stuff, then come back as the priest. I tinker my way through painstakingly again and again from the beginning. I edit as I go. Outside of the beginning of idea generation, I start tinkering with language in a very precise way. If people don't like what I do, it's on purpose. Not in the sense that I'm trying to alienate some of them, but it's not an accident. I did say what I meant to say. So in terms of building and structure, I think everybody has places where they have their own war with structure. For a lot of people, if you're writing novel length work, it's going to be that turn out of the setup. When you're creating voice, or you're creating world, or you're creating crisis, you're introducing characters, it's very exciting. And then it's all on the page and something has to happen from it. That's where the tendency to then go back a few squares and start telling it in another way, the same thing can happen. Or there's like all sorts of ways. And that's the part I find sometimes you have to just like beat the next section in a little bit till it starts to go. So that for me is a place that structure becomes very conscious at that point. If it's a short story, you're talking about the 3rd or 4th page. Or a novella, it's probably page 20. If it's a novel, you might be hitting this point at 40 or 60, depending on what kind of story you're telling. Less true with what we call genre fictions because there's such a tradition of like what the beats can be on that are sort of expected, and you're playing with it the way you would with a song. So it's a kind of different structure. Yeah, so I think everybody has their place that they will struggle. So I want to ask Nathan, what kind of structure specifically are you talking about, and where have you found you kind of struggle with that or crave more of it, so I can understand?
I was thinking you have something really interesting. How do you build a story around that? It sounds like you kind of just follow the story as it comes out, then you fix it because you're an experienced storyteller. That's what I'm hearing. It's way different than what my brain works, but it's very interesting. Is that basically how you...
That's definitely about exactly what I do. And I think that everybody has a way of accessing their best creativity. Some of us are great in a crisis, and some of us are better with lots of advance warning. Some people emotionally metabolize slower. Some people, were raised by wolves and like they live in crisis. Like everybody has these different, creativity is the same way. How do you trap and corner your own creativity? For me, I kind of thrive in a high wire act where I don't know what's going to happen and I have to be creative. So I will often write as far towards the end of a novel as I can, not having any idea where I'm going to go and cutting off opportunities. So if you think of a novel or work as something that, page 1 is all potential, right? It can go anywhere in any way. So a novel is really the function of collapsing to 0 potential. Last page, 0 potential left. That novel is done. All choices are made, right? So as you're making choices, you are narrowing potential, right? Again and again and again. You're just constantly narrowing potential. So if you're constantly narrowing potential, you have far fewer options as you make choices. So the ability to like make a concrete choice and move, make a concrete choice and move is going to cut things out. And so I find that my own creativity gets stirred by like a vague panic of fewer options. So a lot of times I write without knowing where I'm going to go because and just going, I'm going to trust that when I get there, I know how to do this thing. And that process works for me. I guess I'm kind of a thrill seeker that way, and I like to keep as much curiosity in the work. Novels are long. This one took me forever to write, and I needed the curiosity to keep me going, to give me the stamina, right? And that's why I never plan anything out. I never rehearse it. I don't think it through in my head. Even when I'm really stuck in something, I play all sorts of games about how I write or how I engage or how I get my head out of a box. So that's my process. There are other people, they function just very different.
How many times have you been in a social situation, someone says, "Oh, you're a writer," and you know what's coming next, right? I have an idea for a book. I've got it all worked out. I just got to get it on paper. And you have to silently chuckle because everything you're describing is what they don't know is waiting for them when you just think you've got it all worked out in your head and you try to get it on paper. I liken it to construction. Like, however good the blueprint is, no one ever goes to a job site and puts it together. There's always surprises, right? And the creativity comes in surmounting one obstacle after the next. Ideas beget other ideas. So people who say, I've got it all worked out in my head, that's much like saying, I have my blueprints, now I just got to slap the house together. That's not what's going to happen.
I think you can even take it beyond that in some ways, which is the writer has an emotional experience of the worlds and characters they're creating. Like there's an emotional experience that's created sometimes just by trying to create something beautiful. You know what I mean? Like you are moved by the beauty in the world, you try to reflect it, right? And maybe you do it in such a way that it's meaningful to you and you actually have a sense of that for a second. The other version of that is kind of a maudlin self-obsession, right? Which is almost, I would say, like a tired erotic map. Right? So you're going to sit there and you've got this story that you've been working on forever and you've tweaked it here and you've tweaked it there and you've told it over and over and you've kind of fetishized it over and over. You have sucked the life, all emotional life. You've like relived the experience of everything over and over and you've told it so many times. There is no emotional life left in that story for you. So then when you sit down to write, it's just this pedestrian, awful experience. And then what's on the page doesn't reflect all the emotions you've already had about it, or the way you've told it at a party, or the way you've like thought about it in a coffee shop. Like it just doesn't, there's nothing there. So you put it away and find another part to think about it. So it's kind of like porn addiction. I'm not anti-porn, but like there are people who struggle with that, right? You no longer can contact real people in your life and have a sensual experience of it, right? So you can no longer contact the page and have a sensual experience of it.
You get the immediate gratification of a response from telling this story, and that makes it harder and harder to delay the gratification and go the distance alone and get it down and work it through on paper versus the immediate feedback of somebody going, ooh, ah, that makes it next to impossible then to shut that feed because you're getting high on the feedback, right?
Yeah, that and any tragic story you tell that you tell multiple times, the life starts to drain out of it. Any, as I said, old erotic map that you have, if you're like really into that one thing and it's a really fixed map, then you kind of have to turn up the volume again and again, right? So it's not just that you get the initial hit or the immediate gratification, it's that what you get back from it is diminishing returns as well. The whole process of it is why I will have to say I have never had a woman come up to me and say, I have 15 pages of a novel in my drawer, but it's amazing. Like, I've got a novel to tell. Like that is a God thing 90% of the time. And it just is like, I've had women say I've thought about writing, but I'm afraid, like people have very different relationships. I know those are generalizations. I'm just telling you my experience. In 1,000 interactions, I've never had a woman come up to me and say.
You know what women also don't say? Writing a book is just like giving birth to a child. I will tell you with absolute certainty, it is not like giving birth to a child. Okay? You're emotionally invested. But you know what? I can leave my manuscript in a hot car with the windows rolled up and not go to jail. The two, you cannot draw a parallel.
Thank you. I love that because I actually hate it when people talk about it's your baby. First of all, it's a very gendered, like they don't say it to men a lot. They don't
Right.
say to men, oh, it's your baby. And you just, you've been through a birth experience, like that doesn't really come out in that. What that really says when you hear it, whether it's intended this way, what it's really saying is you have no perspective on your work. You're not qualified to judge. And of course, you're qualified to judge, and you do have a perspective on your work if you're conscious and talking to yourself in some kind of honest way. So there's a bunch of things that's off about that.
Matt asks, really interesting to hear how you often start with dialogue. Just wondering, when reading works by others, do you find yourself drawn to the dialogue, voices within those works, and do you read plays or screenplays? Do you feed that with anything?
I think I've always had a real appreciation for dialogue. I don't read a lot of plays, although I always mean to read plays. I love seeing plays. I would like to write a play someday because I think structurally you're constructing a very particular trampoline or fly trap, and I would love to see how to do that more. Sometimes being good at dialogue can be kind of a trap. So for instance, if you've ever seen the movie from the 30s, Rosalind Russell, His Girl Friday. The dialogue in that runs so fast you can almost not hear it today. Like you can almost not follow it so fast, and it's so funny and it's so sharp, right? It is such a smart ass back and forth, and go watch it. And so I think my initial understanding of what dialogue was that. Like I remember I was a weird kid and I watched a lot of old movies, was this kind of like repartee between characters. And then you have on the other hand this sort of like the Hemingway mystique of like, well, look at everything he didn't say, It's like, okay, great, that's good too. But like, there's also, which he got from Catherine Mansfield. What does good dialogue mean is something I think about. Where it comes up for me is I'll tend to just keep going. Like I could write an entire book in dialogue. Like I could absolutely do that, And so I have to figure out how to get out of that sometimes. Somebody, actually it was Richard Nash, was reading a section of the new novel, and one of his favorite parts was where this one character asks something, and it's a very emotionally pregnant moment, and the other character is just like, I don't know, like just no, like it, and he said what struck him about that was there was such confidence to just put in this kind of like vague human response in the middle of that moment without it being laden with it. And what he was saying is a lot of times writers feel like they have to go in and they have to insert something meaningful, or they have to say it just right, or they have to answer the questions. So the question of, do I take in things of dialogue particularly? No, but I do feel like I grew up taking that in quite a bit and was very much part of a very fast verbal retort kind of culture growing up. It's not how my characters talk by and large, but they do tend to have philosophical concerns. And the reason I say that is I actually really think that one of the unique things about this country, to some degree, every American is a philosopher, right?
Yeah.
You run into a guy on a street corner, and you're talking to him for 2 seconds, he's going to start to tell you, well, here's how I see it. And it's usually going to be about the haves and the have-nots. And he's going to have his theory about who's full of shit and who's not. He's going to give you a globalized take on like what's happening in the world, right? I don't even mean politics. It can be anything. It can be like, it doesn't matter, right? And that's sort of whether it's somebody behind a convenience store counter or whether it's somebody, there's this sort of, it's the Bugs Bunny nature of our country in various places, this street storyteller. And it's always has a kind of philosophical, where do you place yourself in the story kind of context. And that's not something I've seen when I lived in Europe. It's not something I saw in Turkey. It's not something I saw in the former Yugoslavia. It is part of this idea that we get to write our future, or we get to have a philosophical take on it, or that our opinion matters at all. It's a beautiful side and a horrific side and a deeply comic side. But I think that when you look at, what gets termed literary fiction, that there's kind of
the air quotes whenever you
yeah.
literary fiction. Yeah.
Well, because
there's a whole other debate.
These are marketing terms, right?
Right.
That's essentially marketing terms. And they are particular to the US because of the MFA system. But I at least have heard, well, humans wouldn't really talk like that. It's like, yeah, they do. I don't know who you know. I go to a party with my friends and everybody talks about what they think everything is happening or their philosophies or their fucking summations of whatever, And I think that there's a sort of anxiety about putting that into, this gets back to your initial question. There's an anxiety about putting that into the work because then it will sound like it's made out of an agenda and that maybe that surfaces the author too much. And I think that's a technique problem, right? Like if the characters are real, the characters are doing what they do. Like I have characters in my book that I'm completely devoted to who I disagree with enormously politically, and that's not a problem for me. I don't have to resolve that. Right. So I think that the fear of sounding, I think it particularly happens around class. I think particularly we have a tendency to treat our, poorer characters or more, economically screwed characters as either funny ambience, right, to create something kitschy in a scene that the real intellectual is passing through, or we treat them as if they are puppets of sympathy. You know what I mean? Like there's all sorts of ways that they become symbolic of things.
Michael asks, would you say you use dialogue as a key part of pacing in a similar way to Aaron Sorkin West Wing with speed of words per minute? And I think you sort of answered that already, but
I'll add one thing with that. I do use it as pacing. I don't use it in the way Sorkin uses it fully as pacing because he's dealing with a different format, a different medium. Sorkin's definitely an inheritor of the His Girl Friday kind of tradition, right? Where I use it is I use it in prose. I use sentence rhythm as pacing because in the medium of writing, we don't have a way to pause the way film does. And so much of our world is created by film and visual imagery. So a camera can hold on a scene. How long that camera stays on that scene tells you a lot about what the director wants you to take from that moment. How serious, how pivotal. If you stay super long, does it get super funny? Like you're going to go through an emotional movement depending on the length and the hold and what's in the frame, right? We don't get to do that. We get chapter breaks, we get double spaces, but basically we don't have that same thing, a slow pan. But in terms of pause, in terms of hold, in terms of holding on a face, we can't hold on a face. So this questions of pacing, how do you write without the ability to really pause in the way that we fill pregnant pauses with meaning? And we don't quite have that in writing because the reader's just going to turn the page to the next chapter. So what are our tools? Well, one of our tools is a change in tone. One of our tools is a change in pacing. If you're coming to a point that's kind of a crescendo, one way of turning it for the next paragraph is to start with a completely different sentence style. Completely different sentence length. Then take that next line and it can be a super long sentence. It tells the readers something is switched here, right? Like they have to physically stop the way they're reading and start to read in another way.
My first go-to that I can always throw at people is that if you want a pause, describe something that takes the duration of that pause. So don't say they sat there in silence for a moment, but say a car horn honked outside and the power lines fizzled. Do something like that.
You can do that in a dialogue. Pause in dialogue it's fairly easy to create, right? Because you go to the physics. But pause in the prose side of it is kind of where I think you struggle a little more to create it.
Do you have a favorite philosopher or a philosopher you come back to regularly?
I think of writers as philosophers. Like I think of Rimbaud as a philosopher. I think Kafka was certainly a philosopher. Dostoevsky was a tortured philosopher, but he's definitely a philosopher and also one of the great comic writers. If you read Crime of Punishment twice, the second time you read it, you will see all the ways that he's making fun of his narrator with other characters. And it's just hilarious. Razumikin is one of the funniest characters in literature. When you read it the second time and you're not deadly focused on what's happening, you get to see all of these like kind of constant poking at the seriousness of his characters. So, I like the situationalists in terms of like actual philosophers like Guy Debord and people like that I found kind of fascinating, sometimes kind of obnoxious and sometimes kind of fascinating.
You were mentioning in another interview about, on one hand, we have the tenet of storytelling that every scene needs to move the story forward, right? but then talking about, say, road stories, road trips, which you're a fan of. And you said yourself you've logged in 15,000 miles just hitchhiking as a teenager, right? Which
The conversation you're referring to is where I was talking about the problems of writing road trips in general. How do you write about repetition? You might meet multiple characters that are sort of like each other, but then one thing that's specific about one is meaningful. One thing is specific about others, but if you just condense them into like a symbolic character, there's something that's getting lost in the experience of what it's really like to be traveling. And in my case, because I was in and out of cars, in and out of situations, like the experience was very different than just driving across, you know what I mean? Like it was multiple circles and cycles of experience. My characters in this novel aren't going through quite that, right? So these trips are a little bit more linear than the sort of repetitious experience. I think that where I tried to bring in the sense of elements of things was in the prose, not the dialogue. What I tried to capture with this one is the wildness of road experiences in certain places and how that you kind of get so tired it's just normal. When I was a teenager and I was 15, I was living pretty much in truck stops, you know, in the back of trucks, sleeping while we were driving, all this kind of stuff. Also spent a little bit of time in towns where sleeping on the streets. And I remember very vividly that if you spend enough time sitting on the ground on a street corner, it just starts to feel like your living room. Like there is a transition that happens where it gets normalized. And this is the same when you're traveling and you're traveling with nothing and you're kind of battered by the seas in a certain way. And that just becomes part of what's ordinary. But the questions for me in writing some of this stuff was, how do you write characters that aren't moving on a character arc, but are like cycling around things and maybe they just are doubling down?
Wow, normally it's a little more of a trail off here, but I know you have to go again. Congrats on everything. Really digging the book so far. Is there any one last bit of mic drop wisdom you can drop on the working writers in the room?
I could say one thing really quickly, which is I believe firmly in belligerent defense of your own instinct. I really do. I see people go again and again to like a million agents, to seminars, to this and to that. Some people like that like back and forth kind of thing a lot, and other people are really, it's destructive. There's a lot of requests for performative modesty, particularly for women writers out there, that is not demanded of male writers, and it's consistently demanded of women writers. Critiques you get may be absolutely pointless. If it makes you want to write more, that's good feedback. If it makes you want to not write, that's not working.
We can find you. Your website is vanessaveselka.com. You've got an author page on Facebook, and I think you got a Twitter account. Thank you. You're awesome. Congrats on everything.
It's been great.
Everyone, thanks for chiming in.
Thank you all.